Welcome to the Northland Bassin Podcast with fishing guide John Myhre and bass tournament angler Ken Milender. On the Northland Bassin Podcast, we cover everything bass fishing for both largemouth and smallmouth here in the Wisconsin Northland and all across the northern tier of Midwest states. Hello, folks. I'm John Myhre, and sitting here with me is co-host on the Northland Bassin Podcast, Ken Milender. And Ken, we're going to be talking bass fishing again.
Yeah, it's midsummer right here in Hayward, and they're in every depth right now. And with all the rain we're getting, you still a lot of largemouth up shallow.
You bet. Well, largemouth, smallmouth. The smallmouth will move deeper, though, I think, on most of the lakes from what I've seen in here, and except for the flowages and the rivers.
Yeah, the current-driven waters, they always seem to live shallow, and I think it's due to the ecosystems within the water body, and then, the predator-prey relationship in regards to going out deep water to get the minnow bite.
You don't think it's the water clarity as much as just the ecosystem that they're in?
Well, water clarity indicates a lot of what type of ecosystem is there, so it seems like the clearer the water, the deeper the ecosystem travels to be at a great strength, so that's why you'll see a lot of minnows out and suspended in deep water around the thermocline, because all the minnows are out there. And then you have the deep water basin insect hatches that, come up, and, all the minnows are out there, and then the big smallies and even the walleyes, and a lot of times muskies too will go out there and suspend and
you bet. Well, let's talk a little bit about the summer largemouth fishing, because, you get up north, whether you're in northern Wisconsin where we're at in the Hayward area, or you get in the UP or northern Minnesota, you got a lot of people up on vacation, and, a lot of people, they say, well, we're on a walleye fish, but, walleye fishing, a lot of times you're better off to wait until the evenings or early mornings or even after dark on some lakes, unless you got ideal conditions or a big chop in the daytime and some wind, but the bass, you can go out and catch fish all the time and have fun, and the largemouth, there'll be a lot of fish up in the weeds and the lily pads and stuff pretty much all summer, won't there?
Majority of the lakes, there will be some bass in the lily pads all summer long. Yeah. For instance, I was just coming back from Marquette, Michigan. I was in there for training for a new company that I started with a couple of months ago, L&M Supply, great company. Anyways, I drove by Dave Lake, that's not too far out of Clam Lake. And,
right.
And if I look at all that slop and the rice and the bog, man, I just wanted to get in my boat and start throwing frogs around there.
Well, Dave Lake is kind of an interesting lake. Anybody that's never fished it, it's it's to the point of where you don't go anywhere fast on the lake, because there's bog stuff underneath the surface up in the north end. Very interesting lake. Actually, it's managed with a 18-inch size limit on largemouth, right?
Yeah, so it's got to be loaded with a bunch of 15-year-old fish.
I know it's a fun lake. It's got a lot of muskies in it too, but it's one of them lakes. It's just, you get up in the north end and you say, man, there's a lot of bogs and wood and timber, and there's some nice weed beds in there and a little bit of everything if you get into it, fishing it. But that's just kind of what you find in a lot of the flowages and reservoirs. Maybe not quite that snaggy and hazardous, but you got a few that are you got to be careful on. One of the big ones, the turtle flambeau over there, you got to be careful when you're driving around on that, because you might be in 25 feet of water, but you may have a 24.5 foot tall stump there.
Yeah, so I got so excited, I pulled over and I opened up my CMAP app, and they were showing, they give some pointers on where the fish are located, but a lot of danger zones as far as stumps and down trees. And granted, bog lakes sometimes can be really acidic, where the pH isn't really great for them, but I'm looking at all this weed growth right next to the bog, so bogs can be really good all year long, as long as there's weeds close by to create a more balanced pH, due to the acidic and alkaline of the weeds. And so I just think there's some 6-7 pound largemouth in there.
Yeah, and the only problem with those type of lakes is that everything changes. I mean, you go out there 1 week and there's the bogs, everything's down on the bottom, and then you go out there the next week and there's mud bogs sticking up, floating up, and and then some of the floating bogs on some of the lakes actually move around on you. So there's no consistency there from one spot to the next on a lot of places. Actually, you got to kind of relearn the lake sometimes, but that's nothing new. I mean, even on the big natural lakes now, with a lot of the weed beds disappearing overnight with people treating them with chemicals, you'll have a spot all picked out, and then you go out there and, oh, darn, that's all wiped out. So you got to learn to, adapt and move around.
Yeah, it seems like on the bog lifts, it has to deal with temperature and sunlight, so it creates activity, so it produces oxygen due to the chemical decomposing matter, and so it floats up when the water gets warm, and then when the water cools down, it sinks back down. Like prime examples, I've been down in the flowage, I go, where'd that thing come from? Where'd that one come from? You drove, there's in 16, 17 feet of water, and then the easiest example would be out on Nelson Lake. Yep. I mean, them center ones float up, and if you get next to the main river channel, I mean, the walleyes will start using that too.
Well, the one thing about the reservoirs too is they tend to age a lot faster than a natural lake, because they were fertile forest ground to start with, and where a natural lake was carved out by the glaciers, whenever back when, and it was basically all rocks and gravel, and now you're making a lake out of stuff with fertile black dirt, and stuff grows and just stuff changes.
Yeah, decaying matter basically ages the lake from a eutrophic to a metamorphic type lake, and it changes the whole ecosystem. As bass is there, and sunfish and even some of the rub fish are really prone to thrive in a metamorphic lake. On the last type of a lake's life cycle. You think back, this whole United States was covered with ice at one time, so all the lakes at their first age, when they got plants, were eutrophic lakes.
Well, here's a good point too, is that you mentioned things decomposing, is that when if you take a lake that's dirty enough, or it's just stained enough that you have limited light penetration, and I know of a couple lakes up here that way, and you get the water temperatures up into that mid to upper 70s, especially upper 70s, you're not having, your weed growth may be limited to 2, 3, 4 feet, and below 5 feet, for instance, you don't have anything growing, nothing green, no algae, and guess what? You got things that are decomposing down there, eating oxygen, so your DO level, dissolved oxygen levels, kind of take a crash down. So basically, a lot of those fish stay a lot higher in the water column than people realize.
Yeah, not to mention the release of methane gas and hydrous ammonia. So, even up in the tundra, up in Alaska and northern part of the hemisphere, you'll see all these bubbles underneath the ice. Well, if you put a torch right there and drill it, it just goes poof. Yeah. I've seen it up on some areas around Lake of the Woods.
Well, most of the reservoirs are flowages. If you watch them, if you're using forward-facing sonar like Garmin LiveScope, you would actually see the bubbles coming up. You can see them moving up through the water column, and that's coming out of the bottom of the lake, and that's probably methane?
Yeah, majority of the time it is. So if you're a bass angler and you like fishing slop, and if you roll in there wide open, you might as well have lunch or a picnic or something, because it'll be a while before the bass will take your frog.
You're stirring everything up. You want to kind of get in there quietly, and quietly is always a good approach anyhow when it comes to fish, because, what using forward-facing sonar, like Garmin LiveScope in both my boats over the last few years, and just observing fish, these fish are a lot more aware that you're there than you think they are. I mean, they'll move away, real quick. They just know you're there, and that's not good.
Yeah, if you got electronics that are pushing 5,000 watts and sound travels in water probably more than 50 times more than it does on air, and their lateral line can pick up a minnow swimming 25 feet away, I mean, it does affect the fish. So I just got done fishing a little club derby on the flowage, and I turned all my electronics off because it was a really tough bite, and ended up winning the tournament. I think it was mostly because I turned all my electronics off and went back to old school fishing, and I ended up losing more than I caught, but I still had enough to win. But
yeah, I know guys that basically will drift into their spot rather than approach it with a trolling motor, and they're successful at stuff.
Yeah, so it was windy. I tried doing controlled drifts, but I used the Trica rod, super 7/4, super sensitive, and I had to make long pitches, so that's why I lost so many, but I did get bit, by using that technique.
You know, I use my power pole on the boat a lot to pin down. I sneak up, drift into an area, and if I think there's going to be some bass in there or some fish in there, I'll drop that power pole down and kind of just sit there and work that area over rather than use spot lock if I can help it.
If I had that, I would definitely have been using it. You know, that's just another tool, a technology through all the different manufacturers that make an angler catch more fish if they use the tools properly.
Well, you know, on the podcast, this edition of the podcast, we've got our local DNR, Wisconsin DNR fisheries biologist, Max Wolter, talking about bass fishing, bass resource, what we have, bass management, and a bunch of stuff. We're going to have that coming up here, but first we need to talk a little bit about our major sponsors here, because we're in the Hayward area, Hayward, Wisconsin, and we've got the Hayward Area Chamber of Commerce, and we've got the Hayward Lakes Visitor and Convention Bureau. You know, Hayward is kind of it's a big destination for a lot of vacationers and tourists. I mean, we have just a ton of water here. I don't remember exactly how many lakes we've got,
495 lakes, and just in Sawyer County. Now, Sawyer County is only like a few miles out of town, right, to get to Washburn, and they have a lot of lakes too. And a lot of these lakes are just relatively untouched, and there's a lot of secret lakes. You can go out there and catch 100 bass in a day.
Oh, you got the rivers, the Namacaga and the Flambeau River. You got the Chippewa River. All those are good smallmouth fisheries for fishing smallmouth. You know, and we've got some, like you said, some remote lakes, but we've got the big lakes. We've got the Chippewa Flowage here, which Chippewa Flowage is the largest wilderness lake in Wisconsin. I believe it's the second largest lake in Wisconsin, inland lake, but man, that thing is like, there's 170, 200 islands on the lake, and there's more miles of shoreline. It's a very complex lake because it was dammed up, 11 lakes, natural lakes dammed up, and the river systems to create one big lake. And it's actually got more shoreline area. It's like 15,000 acres, I believe, give or take. And it's got more shoreline than, they say, Leech Lake does in Minnesota with over 100,000 acres. So that means it's complex. You got all these bays and coves and islands and backwaters and then different colors of water. I mean, you can change it. But that's just one of the resources here. We've got a lot of resources. And if you're just into the vacationing stuff, too, you got miles and miles of trails. You got snowmobile, ATV trails, hiking trails, biking trails. There's just so much to do in the Hayward area here. It's a great destination for people who want to go there. It's a place to find solitude and adventure if you want. So, you know, Hayward Lakes, you go to Hayward. If you want more information, you like to order a vacation guide that they publish, you can go to haywardlakes.com. Also, if you go to the haywardareachamber.com website, they have a ton of information. And then if you go to our radio website for my radio show, it's wnoradio.com. A lot of great information there. And, kind of support our sponsors out there and make this podcast possible. Ken, I mentioned we were going to talk to Max Wolter.
Yep. And then this weekend we have the Lumberjack Days in town. So there's competitors that travel all over the United States, and then I think there's even a couple different country competitors that come into town. And
that's one thing in the summertime, a lot of big events. That'll be over with the time we air this or publish this, put this up on the podcast. But anyway, a lot of good stuff there. Right now, we're just going to jump right into that talk I had with Max, and he had some good points to talk about bass management and size structure and a bunch of things. We're down at the Hayward DNR Ranger Station talking to our fish biologist, Max Wolter. And Max, great to have you on here on edition of the Northland Bass and Podcast. And we're going to talk about bass fishing, which is something we don't really talk about that much up north because it's always walleyes, crappies, buskies, but we've got great bass fishing.
We do, yeah. And it's probably one of the most consistent fisheries, and it's one of the ones that I think surprises people, when they kind of look at what's out there as far as quality options in all these lakes. Like you said, walleye kind of have that prestige. They have that reputation. It's something people associate with the North. But we have really fantastic smallmouth fishing in both lakes and rivers in this area. And we actually have surprisingly good largemouth fishing as well.
Well, and you said surprisingly good. The interesting thing is that, I look at the average club tournaments weigh-ins, and I look at what they're down farther south. You can go Illinois, down in Missouri, whatever. A lot of weigh-ins run anywhere from 15 to 20 pounds. We see that up here.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. we have some really productive bass fisheries. I think smallmouth grab people's attention because they are less common throughout the whole country, right?
Yep.
So, you look at what our area does very well. We have some really good smallmouth lakes, our big, deep, clear lakes, like our Round, Grindstone, LCO, of course, are kind of the most well-known ones. But then we have really good river fisheries that are popular too. And obviously that's not quite the same thing. It's not the club night with the ranger boats
Right.
and, weigh-ins and stuff. But there are people that love those opportunities and are coming here specifically to seek those out on a float trip or with a drift boat or whatever. So we kind of have that dual smallmouth fishing opportunity, both in the lakes and the rivers. Largemouth, more so in the lakes, but we have some very good largemouth lakes that attract a lot of tournament interest in this area.
Well, we're seeing more and more tournaments all the time, and we're getting more attention on bass. You can even go into the bait shops now up north where 40 years ago, very little bass stuff. Now there's a ton of it.
There's a whole row of worms now. Yep, absolutely. And the thing with bass is they are very reliable, right? They bite throughout big portions of the year, big portions of the day. They're fairly abundant, and they're one of the species that's been doing particularly well, even as we've seen these changes in our ecosystems where, conditions are becoming a little less favorable for walleye in some places. Well, what is doing well? It's bass, right? We have high abundance of largemouth bass in some places. We have smallmouth bass that have held really steady and maybe have even improved their trophy potential, over time as catch and release has really set in. Those smallmouth are getting more time to grow. We're seeing lots of 18, 19, 20-inch smallmouth. I caught a 21-inch smallmouth a year or two back. So it's a good time to be a bass angler, and they're a very fun fish.
Just because we say the word bass, though, there is a huge difference between the smallmouth and the largemouth. The smallmouth is more closer to, I think, to like a bluegill than it is a largemouth, isn't it?
Like genetically?
Genetically, or what he eats and stuff.
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, yeah, I would say I'm like a rock bass in many ways. Smallmouth are really keyed in on crayfish, right? That's going to, if they're around, crayfish are going to be a fairly sizable majority of their diet. Will they eat some other fish? Yep. Will they eat some bugs? Absolutely. Will they eat a frog if it happens to swim across their rock bar?
Yep.
Sure. There just aren't many frogs near the rock bars, right? And so that's kind of where you start to see, the habitats they occupy and the foods that they eat line up, right? So largemouth bass are going to be more in those weedier habitats. They're eating a higher percentage of their diet. That might be little bluegills and little perch and crappies and stuff. Largemouth love eating crayfish too. We see a lot of crayfish in largemouth diets. They're eating dragonfly larvae and other big insects. They're eating frogs, of course. So they're both, pretty versatile in what they can eat. It's just kind of what they specialize in and what habitats you find them in dictates what actually winds up in their stomach.
I know years ago we had a real big problem with rusty crayfish in like Round Lake and Middle Eau Claire and up on the Iron River chain up there. I don't know are they still in there now or not comparatively, but it seemed like when the rusty cray show up, and this is happening over in Minnesota right now too, is that these bass really start to get better, bigger, and more of them.
Yeah. So this is kind of a classic ecological thing where you have a new invader, so to speak, in the ecosystem. So when that's the rusty crayfish, they come in, the ecosystem has no experience with them. The rusty crayfish do really well and they boom and they're everywhere. And they start to mow down a lot of the aquatic vegetation and they can change the whole lake, right? Then the ecosystem catches up. And a big part of the catching up, if there's smallmouth in the lake, is the smallmouth are going to boom next. They're going to start eating those rusty crayfish. They're going to have this abundant new food source. And so you may see some of the best smallmouth fishing in the years after the rusty crayfish have kind of become established. Then everything kind of comes into a new equilibrium, right? The rusty crayfish and the smallmouth kind of have figured each other out, so to speak. And so you don't see either species booming, and they're kind of more at an equilibrium from that point forward. So we do still have rusties in most of these big, deep, clear lakes, but they're now, kind of kept in check, so to speak.
Well, and as far as we talked about what the type of habitat they like difference, but there's differences in what they eat. but there's differences in many different aspects when it comes to the difference between a smallmouth and a largemouth.
Yeah, sure. Where they spawn, the temperatures they spawn at are fairly similar. A lot of overlap there, but, smallmouth are going to spawn closer to the areas where they're spending the rest of the year, rockier, sandier stuff. They make kind of the nice, perfect circle nest in the gravel. Largemouth are going to spawn more in a back bay. It's kind of a sandy or more irregularly shaped nest. We even see differences in kind of how prolific they seem to be in reproducing. We see a lot of lakes where largemouth abundance can get quite high. They're doing well, and then they get abundant enough where they start hurting their own size. Right? They're too dense, and so they're competing for food, and you get those populations where it's all 10, 11, and 12-inch largemouth, and it's hard to get much bigger than that. We don't see that as much with smallmouth, at least in this area. I know there's parts in the country where you do see that, but around here, we don't see smallmouth reproducing at that level that's almost too high. And so the lakes that have smallmouth tend to have pretty good size potential around here because they're not getting overly dense.
Well, I know, and you're managing a lot of waters now, and this is happening in Minnesota. It's happening here. A lot of places they're being managed as trophy fisheries. Like, we've got lakes that are 18-inch one fish, limits. Right.
Yep. And we are using that fairly often for smallmouth in some of these super high quality, high potential water bodies that we've been talking about. Our approach for largemouth is different. I think this is worth talking about on a bass podcast where we have a lot of bass anglers. There's a lot of places we're actually taking the minimum size limit off for largemouth, and we're keeping a fairly high bag limit and a fairly long harvest season and telling people it's okay to harvest some 11 and 12-inch largemouth. Some of these ones that, previously would have been protected by a size limit. That's because they're getting too abundant in some places and they're hurting their size. This is not an anti-bass thing. This isn't trying to eradicate largemouth or trying to clear them out so some other species can do better. This is trying to prevent those overly dense populations where the size of largemouth is really poor. So people see that, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from bass anglers. Why do you do this? Why do you do this? That's why. It's because we want high quality size within the largemouth population, and one of the ways to get there is to have less of them, especially at those smaller sizes.
I've actually seen a lot of information, too, from farther south where you're down in Texas or Missouri or wherever, where guys have privately managed ponds by biologists, or they actually go in and mandate pulling so many pounds of small bass out to be able to grow bigger bass.
Yep, that's exactly it. I mean, it's formulaic in many ways. You can look at your acreage and say, well, I can only support this many pounds of bass. Let's say it's 100 pounds. So do you want 100 1-pound bass, or do you want 10 10-pound bass, right? That's kind of how it is. It's like growing carrots in your garden. That's an example I use a lot. If they're never thinned, you get a whole lot of small carrots. If you want to grow some bigger carrots, you have to kind of thin out the crop a little bit. It's uncomfortable at times because bass has become such a catch and release oriented species, and it's held in high regard. It's the folks that really love bass are very protective of them, so it's not always a message that people are immediately receptive to. But it is good fish management, and it's effective to get to our goals of having those nice big 3-4 pound or bigger bass that people are get excited about, whether it's a tournament setting or just casting off the dock.
I know there's even the tournaments, just at tournaments, there's getting to be more and more and more of them, but I don't know. I mean, there a lot of those fish get transported and handled but are we looking at a mortality factor in there compared to when it comes to like muskies, for instance? Muskies, a percentage of them catch and release don't survive. Whether it's a tournament or you're just on your boat fishing, do we need to be handling those bass a lot more careful, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
Sure. Yeah. And there's a lot of research on this from around the country because bass tournaments are so common and popular. And so we kind of know the factors that contribute to higher mortality, and it's predictable stuff. It's how warm is the water? That's a big one, right? Yep. Hotter water, harder on the fish. There's less oxygen in the water, there's more stress. So that's kind of the number one thing. But then there's other stuff. How long did you hold them? How did you hold them? How far are they transported? Stuff like that. There's a whole body of research on do they go back to the areas they were caught from if they're transported a long ways. So we kind of, I think, have a pretty good grasp on the impacts of tournaments. In most cases, it is pretty minimal. If you're talking about a September club tournament with 15 boats on a lake around here, we would expect the mortality of those fish to be pretty low, and that they'll probably get back to where they're going. But, that's just one type of tournament. Every circumstance is a little bit different. And it's kind of in many ways up to the bass fishing community to decide, how they want to have their tournaments and where to be, as easy on the fish as possible.
Well, they have regulations in the tournaments. I mean, tournaments, I think, are a lot better on the fish as far as the handling because they know how to handle a fish, and they have really good regulations as far as live wells to transport them in. They actually even add stuff to the live well to make sure to protect the slime and stuff on the fish.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's the technology, has come a long ways. And so we can do everything we can on a fish welfare standpoint. And the other thing that's becoming more popular, and we're seeing it pop up, is just immediate release formats, right? Similar to what muskie's done now. Nobody's bringing a muskie into a weigh-in anymore or killing it and putting it on ice for a tournament. Bass has the opportunity to do the same thing, right? There's apps now where you can do stuff, or other what we call paper tournament formats where you don't do the traditional weigh-in, and then it's just another day of fishing, right? You're just catching fish, registering them on the spot without them having to be transported or kind of have those additional stress factors. Because even under the best circumstances, it is additional stress. Yep. In a lot of cases, it's stress that the fish will do fine with, but there's just no way around that. It is additional stress if you're holding a fish for a period of time and doing a weigh-in. Lots of things we can do to make it as easy as possible, minimize that stress. But one of those is, considering those other tournament formats. And I'm always talking to organizers about that. I certainly understand the appeal of doing the big, communal weigh-in and everybody getting to see all the fish. It's very exciting. I used to fish bass tournaments. I totally get it. So I'm not anti by any means, but we want to, just have open conversations about this stuff. Talk about it. Get people thinking about the pros and cons, right? Yep.
Well, yeah, and there are people out there that, like you said, fish belt tournaments, and there are people out there that say, why have we got tournaments out there? But, it can all work together. And, I've seen, we almost had a war on bass here a few years ago where, they were blaming them for the species or walleyes or whatever. But the fact is that you take smallmouth, which is our primary trophy fishery up here, or the bass, they cohabit just great and fine. Actually, walleye fishing, you could be catching a walleye and then a smallmouth on the same spot.
Yep. That's right. There's research on that, too. There's a pretty strong correlation between great walleye lakes and great smallmouth lakes. And, what's the correlation there? Are they helping each other? Are they buddies? No, it's not really how it works in nature. It's that they're sharing similar habitats, right? If you have deeper, rockier lakes, you're going to have good habitat for both of those species.
You think we're going to see good bass fishing maintained up here with the new regulations and stuff? And I foresee more lakes being added to those better regulations on smallmouth too in the future.
Yeah. I mean, like I was saying earlier, bass are very resilient. They're one of the species that we expect to be doing well now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now. They're doing great in all corners of the country, really all corners of the globe. They're very good at what they do. They're what we call a generalist, and generalists can handle a lot of different disturbances, whether that's shoreline development or, increasing water temperatures. They do great with it. So, yeah, bass are something that, we kind of want to settle into and manage to the highest potential. That includes trophy smallmouth. It also includes, high quality largemouth, trophy largemouth opportunities where we can do it. Creating, a bass fishing population that is obviously respecting the fish, understanding kind of the most effective ways to manage them. Catch and release will certainly play a huge role in that, but there are places where harvest of some bass makes some sense too. They taste great. I know another maybe potentially unpopular thing to say on a bass fishing podcast, but if you're being selective about when and where you harvest them, you can create better bass fishing opportunities through that method.
Well, Max, a lot of great information there. And one thing is this, you and I have to go bass fishing. We'll probably go after some big smallmouth out there this summer if we get a chance.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I love smallmouth fishing. Was kind of my first joy. It's one of the things that, led me to being a fish biologist, was growing up and fishing a lot of smallmouth, especially on rivers. So I love living in a place that has really good smallmouth. Let's get out there.
Well, thanks, Max. Well, Ken, Max is always interesting. I get him on the radio show. With that radio show I do quite often, and I had a chance to talk to him a little bit about the bass fishing. And, we almost had a war on bass. I mentioned that to Max, too, a few years ago. People were wanting to blame them for, walleyes and not being able to catch walleyes. But there's a lot of other factors going on with the walleyes, not to mention harvest levels on them. I don't think there's a whole lot of catch and release when it comes to walleyes.
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of data from a neighboring state in regards to, do bass eat walleyes, and it's not substantiated through any scientific studies in regards to the biggest thing about walleyes when you're stocking them, the water temp's got to be below 50 degrees, or the survival rate ain't that great. And then the other thing is, through scientific data, most of the raised walleyes are weed oriented, so I think northerns and even other walleyes can affect the survival rate of fingerlings into adulthood in, some of the stock lakes. And, with the DNR's budget now, there's not as much funding, to stock area lakes with walleyes. So, it's better to use selective harvests and, let the bigger ones go back. And, so the anglers have to realize the conservation of the fish species that we have, especially with forward-facing sonar. Going out there in 30 feet of water and ripping walleyes up to the surface and their bladders out their throat, and they're forced to throw them back in the lake because it's against the law to possess them. But, but there is educational tools out there in regards to how to weight the fish in a live well, which you can't do in our regulations. You give them a couple hours, they'll reabsorb that air back into their body system so they can swim to those depths. And then there's fizzing them.
And it's still not good, though. It's just if you can avoid doing the deep water fishing. I mean, I've caught walleyes at 70 feet of water, but they blow up like a balloon, too. So, you unless you're keeping the fish, you're catching the keeper-size fish, or the regulations allow it. I just tend people to just focus on the fish, 20 to 25, 28 feet of water, depending on the time of the year, and leave those fish in 35, 40, 45 feet alone, basically.
And so my theory is just let those fish reproduce the next spring and go bass fishing, because you can catch a lot more and they're a lot more fun, especially when you go skyrocketing out of the water. I mean, when I watch the youth catch largemouth or smallies that go airborne, that's a lifetime memory for them.
And you mentioned walleyes, bass eating walleyes. Fish eat fish, and it depends on the high population of whatever. And with the knowledge that anglers have today, the mapping, the sonar, and everything else, it's time where we have to start thinking about how many walleyes do we need to keep. We're going to release these fish and take some of the pressure off of them, because, and this is just my opinion, but you knock the walleye population down in enough that has largemouth, then you're going to have an increase in largemouth bass, because there's more predators out there that are going to fill it. And at that point, maybe smaller walleye fry do get eaten by some bass, but if you've got a balanced fishery, you're in better off shape. So, there's a lot of factors involved there, but one of the biggest things is harvest and management with people on their own. People should be looking at what they need to do, not just say, well, heck, it's the DNR's job. Max talked about a bunch of stuff. He talked about how they manage and the need to remove some of the smaller bass, because, I become aware of that by talking to some people I know down in Texas and down south that have these private bass ponds, and they'll go out and weed out a lot of the smaller 8 and 10-inch bass just so they can grow some bigger bass. So if you got a lot of little fish in a lake, you don't have a lot of big fish.
Well, based upon environmental conditions in the spring, you can have some really strong year classes, and when you need a balance of each age year class, going to make the lake sustainable to be a trophy lake. So there are instances where you have really strong year classes, and there might be 2 year classes ahead of it that are weak. You need to thin them out, so it needs a balance for any ecosystem. In regards to control of sunfish, if largemouth are not present, sunfish can become overpopulated and stunted, and that's where you're seeing a lot of these small northerns being more populated in the lakes, because there's opportunists with more sunfish, and a lot of lakes are trying to get rid of rid of the northerns, which, yeah, they cost me a lot of money during the course of summer, so I'm a proponent of that.
Well, bass eat a lot of little bluegills too. So
Yes, they do.
And yeah. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about gear and rigs and stuff. And one of the things that's popular in the summertime is topwater bait fishing. Let's talk a little bit about that topwater fishing. I mean, what do you recommend for people for gear to start out if they haven't got into it? What rod do you like? The action of the rod, the length of the rod, and then what kind of line? What are you going to recommend? You've done a lot of tournament fishing.
Well, a few years ago, I started using Myhre fishing rods. You can primarily just buy them online for $120. They're technique specific. Took them like 5.5 years to develop them so they don't break. So most rods break because the graphite is too tight. So for instance, if you're going to lift a 3.5 pound bass, up at 12 o'clock or even 1 o'clock, the rod's going to tend to break. So most of the time, if you're going to lift the fish up to your hand without hitting the boat, you want to lift and keep your rod, below 1030. And most high-density graphite rods won't break. Majority of the rods that I see customers break is when they lift the bass too high up. And then, but Myhre Fishing, they have a glass composite in some of their rods, so they have the right actions. You can use it with fins braid right out of the box, or you can use it with mono, and they have a strong hookup ratio on any type of reaction bait. And then they've got Carolina rig rods and frog rods that have just the right action to give it a hesitation to get the hook into the fish's mouth, and I like them. And then Trica rods are super sensitive. They are what they say they are, and they're 100% graphite. They have hollow handles that are graphite wrapped that transfer vibrations. So if you need a bomb cast or pitch thick cover, that is a go-to rod. I mean, I'm totally impressed, but they're going to be a $300, $400 rod. And then now they have ceramic bearing reels to make it super light and last a lifetime. But that's an online order item.
You like a little slower action rod for topwater and crankbaits versus a real fast action rod?
Yeah, yes, I do. Especially when they come airborne, you can't. It just seems like, once the hook's pinned, you don't need a lot of force or rod, to move the fish around. Biggest advice when you get a really big fish, it's important to move the boat to keep the boat on the same side of the fish that it's hooked, because when they cross over their mouths, they'll use the bait as leverage, and if they're just skin hooked, they will rip the hook out. But if you keep the boat, and this is true with every species, even muskies, try to keep the boat on the same side of the fish that's hooked, and you might have to follow it around. And I think the last big fish I caught was like a 52-inch muskie on 14-pound test line, and I just kept the boat moving, and I ended up landing the fish.
Well, when you're talking about the line and stuff too, I know on most of my bass rods, with the exception of a couple really light finesse rig stuff, most of them I'm running like 35 pound braid on them, and then I'll run like a 15-pound fluorocarbon leader that's like 10, 15 feet long with like a double union knot to join it. There's a bunch of different knots you can use, but is that what you kind of like to think of the braid? And you can get away with the heavier braid now because the diameter of this stuff is like 10, 12-pound test line.
Yeah, like fins makes a really small diameter per pound test than any other company, and then their Infinity Black is what I use for frog fishing, 40 or 50 pound, because it just casts a country mile, and when you get a wind nut or backlash or professional overrun, as I like to refer them to, it doesn't lock itself in, so you can just spool it back out and cast again.
You're talking about that Finn's 40G line, because that's a thinner diameter than the regular braid they have. And heck, I got 85-pound test braid on bass reels, like 200 size bass reels that I actually throw the small musky lures on, and it's not any bigger than like 15-pound test line or 17-pound test line or mono, I think.
Yeah, the 40G is their top of the line. Costs like $30 some for a spool, but It doesn't have a lot of abrasion. So the XPS is their number one abrasion line. So you can get by using it in a lot of applications, especially when you want something small diameter. That a lot of guys are doing for scoping. They want the smallest diameter per pound test, and then they're going with 6-pound fluorocarbon to get more bites.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to that fluorocarbon too, is the 6-pound gets more bites. But I tell people is that if you're fishing where you got a lot of them little hammer handle pike, use as heavy a fluorocarbon as you can get away with and still get your bites, because once you start getting up past 12-pound, 14, 15-pound fluorocarbon, it's a little tougher for them little sniper northerns to bite your lure off on you. 6-pound, they can still cut that off pretty quick, but when you start getting a little bit bigger, so if you can get away with it, you got to experiment. If you're not getting bites, you drop back down in leader size, but a little heavier leader. I mean, most of my crankbait rods for walleyes and stuff, all of them have got like 15-pound fluorocarbon leaders, simply because I'm tired of losing Rapalas and stuff to them little tiny northerns.
Yeah, for several years, yellow was the number one color, so anglers could see it, but they're only throwing like a 4-foot leader on there, and it's like, boy, I can see 12 feet, and that fish is going to see that yellow, and yellow is one of the number one colors that keeps deflecting its color and through the depths, and that's with Lauren Hill. He invented the combo selector. He did a lot of scientific data on reflective of color that according to what humans see, and then like walleyes, they have twin cones and single cones. One's to see oranges and the other one to see greens. That's why they go after perch so well.
Line visibility, I've proven to myself more than once, it does make a big difference. And it seems to make a difference, whether you're walleyes or bass fishing or whatever, seems to make a bigger difference the slower your presentation is, whether you go all the way down from a finesse bass rig to a bobber rig. The slower the presentation, the longer that fish can look at it, especially if it's in open water. If you're fishing a slow presentation in the weeds, I don't know if it's quite as important, because they got all kinds of things that are weed and stalks and everything in their line of view. But once you break away from that weeds and cover, if you're fishing a crankbait really quick or snapping a jerk bait, line visibility is not quite as big a factor, but when you're sitting there right in their face for a long time, that's where it really starts to come in.
Yeah, so on the times where I do use braid, I'll use Cigar and Vizex. It's expensive, but it's worth it. With the exception of topwater. So most fluorocarbons sink. Topwater, you want that line to float. And even if I'm going to throw braid on it, I usually throw my fluorocarbon or regular line twice the depth that I'm fishing.
Using it in Vizex in the fluorocarbon.
Yeah, that's for fishing the depth. So on topwater, you want to use a floating line. Like Trillium XL is 17-pound works in a lot of applications. If you start to go with a smaller diameter, you have to hold your rod up a little higher to keep the line off the water, especially when you're going to throw a spook. Once you get it going, you can lower your rod tip, where it's better to get that spitting action when you're spooking it over to the corner. It flicks water up, and that triggers more fish.
And one tip I'm going to make sure I put out there is, if you're fishing a frog or you're fishing a topwater bait, keep another rod rigged with maybe a Texas rigged worm, because if you catch a fish out of an area, there's probably more fish there that are not responding to baits. You throw a worm in there and snake it through the pads or the grass, you probably catch more fish. If you get a blow up, sometimes you throw back at them with that plastic worm, you'll catch that fish. So, anytime I'm fishing the frogs or fishing shallow water, the slop and stuff with topwaters, I'm carrying an extra rod rigged with a plastic worm. Sometimes a wacky rig, but most often it's just an unweighted Texas rigged worm with a 4 or 5 aught EWG hook in it, and I can throw that in almost anything and drag it back through.
Very, very true. There's 2 baits. I use a 10-inch power worm due to the scent. And then brush hog. It has a lot of activities. So there have been a lot of times a frog will swirl up in your bait, and now all of a sudden that fish is 3 feet away from where you visually seen is that action. So if you throw something in there near that, just let it sit there. Eventually he'll come and pick it up. And And that takes a lot of patience, especially when you know there's a big one there and you want to keep reeling. Try not to disrupt the weeds around it. So once you make that pitch in there, if you're off a little bit, just let it sit. 60% of the time, that fish will come pick it up.
A lot of great, interesting stuff we talked about there today. You know, upcoming podcasts we coming up. I've got, Matt Steffen, bass tournament angler, has that core tackle company too. We've got him. We've got a talk I had with Jim Milender a little bit, talking about fishing for friends of mine, and then I've got Lee Bailey Jr., he fished the Bassmaster Classic, retired longtime bass fisherman, now lives down in Florida and he guides down there, but he came from up in the northeast part of the country fishing smallmouth. And trying to think who I got Larry Dahlberg. We've got a thing on there with Larry we can run. We got a bunch of different people in there that, we've got a chance to talk to, and there'll be some interesting podcasts coming up. But, right now we're wrapping up this podcast. I want to remind people again, we're up here in the Hayward, Wisconsin area, up in northwest Wisconsin. Got a lot of great water here. We've got great water for bass all across the northern tier of states now. Don't just figure, well, I want to fish for walleyes. If you want to have fun, the bass fishing is where it's at. I think a lot of times, you want more information on the Hayward area here, the Hayward Visitor and Convention Bureau, go to their website at haywardlakes.com. Hayward Area Chamber of Commerce, their website is haywardareachamber.com. I've got a radio webpage. I've got a bunch of stuff on there. That's wnoradio.com. A lot of places to get more information on the Hayward area here in northwest Wisconsin. And boy, I'll tell you what, we're a lot of time here. We're wrapping up here. It's been interesting talk. Next week, I think next couple of weeks, we'll have Matt Steffen on here talking about bass fishing.
Yeah, I've been following Matt and Johnny Schultz and Randy Blunkett. They're all part of the Fish the Moment, and they are excellent experts on certain applications and certain techniques that I've gathered a lot of information from in the last few years.
Well, folks, we're wrapping up the podcast here as usual. If you like what we're doing here, let us know. If you got questions, there's a comment thing. If you go to the website, it's northlandbassin.podbean.com. That's the whole site for the podcast. There's a place there to ask questions or comments. You can leave comments on it. And if you need any suggestions, which you'd like to hear us talk about. And you can always, subscribe to the podcast and like it too. So a lot of options there for you. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and we'll be back again with another podcast, Ken.
Yeah, if you're up there in the Hayward area when the frog migration starts, go out to Dale Lake and give us a report.
You bet. Well, thanks for listening, folks. Well, folks, that about wraps up this edition of the Northland Bassin Podcast. If you'd like more information on the Hayward, Wisconsin area, check out the Wisconsin Northland Outdoors Radio Show on our other podcast channel, wnoradio.podbean.com. Or for even more information, on the web at haywardlakes.com or haywardareachamber.com. Thanks for listening, and watch for our next Northland Bassin podcast. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe to the channel.